the guardian of the silent wood. In a forgotten fold of the world, nestled between hills that slumbered like tired giants and clouds that whispered secrets to the canopies below, there stretched a forest so old, so profoundly wrapped in its own green dreams, that even the wind walked softly through its corridors. They called it the silent wood not because it lacked sound, for the rustle of leaves, the whisper of wings, and the creaking bones of ancient trees composed an eternal symphony, but because it held a silence that was sacred, a who-sh not of absence, but of reverence, like the stillness before the first note of a requiem, or the pause a poet takes before uttering the word that will crack the world in half. It was in this wood, not marked on any map save the ones inked in memory and madness, that Elgan dwelled. Not lived, no. Elgan did not live in the ordinary, measured way that men live in cities and cottages, with walls and clocks and predictable ends. He dwelt like the rocks, like the roots. Elgan was a fixture of the forest, not merely a guardian by duty, but a part of its breathing skin, a wrinkle in its time-worn bark. He had no age, or perhaps he had all the ages at once. His beard was white as lichen in winter, his spine bowed like a river's path, and his eyes, oh, those eyes were green as the moss and deep as old sorrow, eyes that had seen things bloom and break and bloom again. Elgan's cabin, if such a humble word could be given to what resembled more a temple of wood, stone, and memory, was perched at the edge of a glade shaped like a sleeping heart. Ivy crept along the walls, bees hummed drunkenly in and out of carved window frames, and the chimney exhaled a slow curl of smoke that smelt of herbs and pine and sometimes, faintly, of forgotten dreams. No one remembered who had built the cabin. Some said Elgan had raised it himself, stone by stone, after waking from a dream in which the forest spoke. Others whispered he had simply found it there, as one finds a shell on the beach, waiting for the right ear to press itself to its spiral mouth. The forest had many moods, and Elgan knew them all. He could read the sky through the flicker of leaves, could sense the coming of rain in the way squirrels sharpen their movements, or in the sudden hush that fell when owls blinked and turned toward the east. He knew where the wolf mothers birthed their litters, and where the mushrooms sang songs only spores could understand. He knew the sacred places, the stones shaped like sleeping beasts, the tree with a hollow that bled amber on solstice nights, the pond that mirrored not your face but your soul. And yet, for all his knowledge, there was something Elgan had forgotten, or had never known, something nestled deep beneath the roots of the silent wood, like a seed waiting for the moon's true silver to awaken. But Elgan did not yet suspect this. He wandered his paths each day with a staff of twisted alder wood, a pouch of dried herbs and strange tokens at his hip, and a soft chant on his lips. A chant older than language, gifted to him, he claimed, by a fox who once walked on two legs and had the voice of a grandmother. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words came out like mossy stones, slow, heavy, and wrapped in green. The few villagers who dared live at the edge of the forest, in the hamlet of Draywick, whose crooked chimneys barely breached the mist, knew of Elgan as one knows of a legend one pretends to disbelieve, but secretly praise too. He was the man to whom they sent offerings on the nights of blood, moons and leaf fall, the one they blamed when crops failed and thanked when rain came gentle and healing. Children dared one another to leave pebbles at his gate, Lovers made vows beneath trees he'd blessed with silent nods. He was both myth and man, both feared and followed. Elgan kept journals, bound in bark and stitched with hair from unknown beasts. In them, he drew symbols that moved when not looked at directly and wrote verses in a language that changed depending on the time of day. He brewed tinctures that glowed faintly under starlight and whispered to the saplings so that they grew straighter, stronger, wiser. The forest spoke to him in rustlings and riddles, in the patterns left by deer tracks and the dreams that came when he slept with his hand resting on the roots of the great tree. Ah, the great tree. At the heart of the forest, deeper than any path dared to tread, stood a tree so immense it bent the light. Around it, so ancient its bark bore the stories of extinct creatures and lost empires. Its branches, stretched into the clouds and possibly beyond them, its roots were said to tickle the belly of the underworld. Elgan had seen it only once, or perhaps it had seen him, on a night so clear the stars dared not blink. He had walked for days, perhaps years, and when he emerged into the grove, he had fallen to his knees, not in worship but in recognition, like one meeting an ancestor in a dream. But that was long ago. Now, Elgan's days were simpler, or seemed so. He tended the forests. Wounds, a snapped limb here, a wounded fox there. He sang lullabies to angry streams and buried bones no man remembered above ground. And every month, without fail, on the night of the full moon, he sat at the threshold of his cabin and stared into the darkness, as if waiting for something that might never come, or something he feared might finally return. The villagers, in their cups, said he waited for a lover lost to the trees, or for a beast he had once banished with fire and regret. Others said he had once been a prince who chose bark over crown, or that he was not a man at all, but a tree that had learned to walk to better protect its kin. Elgan himself neither confirmed nor denied these tales. He simply watched and waited, and when the wind turned, just so, he would mutter a name no one else could hear and press a hand to his chest, as though to calm the heartbeat of a memory too wild to cage. The seasons turned like ancient gears, grinding slow and sure. Autumn came draped in gold and crimson, and the forest shimmered with the dignity of old kings. Winter whispered frost onto every branch and kissed Elgan's beard until it glistened like hoarfrost. Spring stirred the forest with green. Fingers, and even the stones sighed awake. Through it all, Elgan moved like the shadow of a tree at dusk, present, shifting, uncatchable. But time, oh, time is a way of uncoiling, of nudging even the most rooted from their rest. And so it was, on a night when the moon rose fuller than ever before, bloated with memory and meaning, that Elgan saw it, not with his eyes, but with something deeper, older, a path. A path where no path had been the night before, a path made not of dirt or stone, but of light and leaf and longing. It glowed faintly, like embers caught in a sigh, and it wound into the forest with a certainty that felt both familiar and terrifying. Elgan did not stand. He did not cry out. He simply watched, and something in him, something buried so deep it had nearly turned to root, began to stir. For the first time in many years, the forest held its breath. The owls did not call. The wind did not dance. Even the stars seemed unsure whether to shine. And Elgan, old, moss-covered, whisper-wrapped Elgan, felt his feet begin to move. The path, if such a fragile and flickering phenomenon could bear so mundane a name, did not appear with fanfare, nor with the heralding rustle of drumskins made of storm clouds or antlers of lightning. No, it unfurled like a sigh, like a thread of silver teased loose from the fabric of an old cloak, the kind a widow might wear on the anniversary of a memory too sharp to name. It shimmered in the moonlight, not in a way that cast shadows or revealed terrain, but in that peculiar fashion of things that glow from within, like the eyes of cats or the glance of truths buried too long. Elgan, who had spent more than half a century tracing paths real and imagined through the silent wood, knew the trails by name and by taste, the salt tang of the Root Pass Trail, the earthy bitterness of Thorncurl Hollow, the damp sweetness of Birch Skin Run. But this new path, this thing of mist and memory, had no name on his tongue, only a whisper in his blood, a slow, coiling ache like that of a limb long asleep beginning to remember the language of movement. He did not question the path's origin, for men like Elgan do not waste breath on the impossible. They have lived long enough to understand that the world's strangest truths prefer silence over explanation. Instead, he stood at its threshold, one foot still resting upon the familiar moss of his clearing, the other twitching with that ancient and terrible yearning that afflicts all those who guard forgotten things. The ache to follow what has been hidden from you, especially when it calls not with voice or logic, but with a familiarity older than selfhood. Elgan inhaled deeply, and the scent that met his nose was not that of the summer-laden forest, not the sap-drip of pine, nor the fungal musk of rotting oak, nor even the resinous sweetness of sun-warmed bark, but rather something stranger, something impossible, the scent of cold iron left in the sun, of a child's hair after sleep, of parchment sealed with wax, shaped like tears. He closed his eyes and felt his heart thrum in patterns unfamiliar, not like the heartbeat of a man, but like the slow, groaning cadence of trees creaking in unison before a storm. And then he stepped forward. The first step was the hardest, not for fear of what might lie ahead, but because it demanded something no longer native to Elgan's limbs. Trust, not in the forest, which he had known like the inside of his own eyelids, but in himself, in that ancient version of Elgan that had once been young, foolish, and willing to chase shadows in hopes they might become wings. The path did not lead straight. It wound like a memory retold too many times, its curves strange and unnecessary, doubling back upon itself, teasing him with glimpses of places that should not have been near, the Stag's Hollow, where the moonlight once froze a deer in gold, the Thorn Tunnel, long collapsed in storms past. Even the Singing Stones, which he hadn't seen in 30 years and which should, by all reckoning, have been half a day's walk to the south, and yet here they were, turning up like uninvited guests at a funeral, solemn and expectant. The moon followed him, high and round, and watching. It cast no shadows, as if unwilling to commit to the truth of Elgan's presence, or perhaps unsure if he walked as a man or something half-remembered. With each step, the forest changed, not in sudden abrupt tie-ins of difference, but in small, subtle disobediences. The leaves rustled in wrong rhythms, the wind curled against the grain of the bark, and the moss grew upward, not down. Elgan said nothing, for there are times in life when words, those loyal beasts of meaning and definition, must be left at the door like muddy boots, and this was such a time. Instead, he moved in silence, his staff thudding softly against ground that seemed both there and not there, solid and smoky, ancient and just born. He walked for what felt like hours and seconds, a contradiction that made sense only in the gut, and just as his legs began to protest, not from pain, but from a kind of mournful nostalgia, he saw it. The arch. It rose from the earth without warning, as though the trees had grown tired of pretending to be trees and had decided instead to perform a miracle. Two great trunks, twisted together like dancers caught mid-embrace, rose 10 paces high before merging into a crown of interlaced boughs and vine. Beneath it, the path narrowed into a thread of light, pulsing softly like the breath of a sleeping beast. Elgan hesitated, not out of fear, but because the air changed, suddenly thick with memory, heavy as a book left too long in a damp cellar. The hair on his arms prickled, and a single word came unbidden to his mind, not spoken, not read, but remembered: Narthiel. He did not know the meaning, but it rang in his bones like a bell struck deep beneath the sea. Beyond the arch, the forest changed again, no longer merely strange, but unmistakably enchanted, in that dangerous, heart-wrenching way known only to places where the boundary between the world and the wordless has worn thin. The trees here were taller, but not in size, in presence. They stood not merely as guardians of soil and sky, but as watchers of fate. Their bark shimmered slightly, not with light, but with intention. Their branches reached toward Elgan not as limbs, but as questions. And the silence. Oh, the silence was no longer the gentle hush of the silent wood, but something else entirely. It pressed upon the ears like velvet soaked in oil, rich and dark and strangely warm. It made the heart beat louder, made each breath feel stolen. In this silence, even thought seemed to trespass. Elgan continued. The path led him to a clearing unlike any he had known. Circular, unnaturally perfect, as though shaped by a hand larger than mountains. At its center stood a stone, neither obelisk nor altar, but something between, smooth, gray, and veined with green. Upon it, etched deep into its flesh, were symbols Elgan had only ever glimpsed in dreams he could not fully recall. Spirals, eyes, trees with roots for arms, moons with open mouths. He reached out, fingers trembling, and as his hand touched the stone, a memory unspooled inside him, long and luminous and laced with grief. He was a boy again, no beard, no staff, just skin and eyes too wide. He was running through the forest, chasing something white and fast, a deer, no, a girl, no, something in between. He was laughing barefoot, and the wind spoke his name like a song. There was a voice calling from behind, a woman's voice, warning, pleading, but he ran on, into the light, into a grove that shimmered, and then darkness, then fire, then nothing. Elgan gasped and fell back from the stone, hand clutching his chest as though to still the panic of a heart that had remembered too much. The clearing blurred. The trees leaned in, curious. The path behind him was gone. He was no longer simply a man in a forest. He was a fragment of something larger, a thread in a story too old for ink. And someone had awakened with him. A rustle came from the trees. Not wind, not animal, presence. A figure emerged, not walking, not gliding, but existing. It was tall, draped in robes of bark and petal. Its face a shifting mosaic of seasons, summer's warmth, winter's grief, spring's wild hope, autumn's solemn memory. Its eyes were hollows filled with starlight, and when it spoke, it did not use words, But Elgan understood. You return, Guardian. Elgan's throat was dry. He licked his lips and tried to speak, but his voice cracked like dried twigs. I do not remember. The figure tilted its head, and the trees behind it echoed the motion, as if all were tied to one great breath. You chose to forget, but the forest remembers. I am only a man, Elgan whispered. The figure stepped forward. Where its feet touched the ground, flowers bloomed, then withered, then turned to seeds that floated upward. You are more. You are Elgan of the grove that was sealed, Elgan of the pact, Elgan who watched as flame took root. Elgan shook his head, but the memories now came like rain on dry earth, sudden, overwhelming, unstoppable. He had made a promise. He had broken it, and something terrible had been born from his forgetting. The figure raised a hand, and in its palm shimmered an image, a grove burning, spirits fleeing, a tree, crying without sound, and at its heart, a boy running, his eyes wide, his mouth open in a scream that never reached the air. You were not to return until the wound was ready to heal. Elgan fell to his knees. What must I do? The figure did not answer. Instead, it stepped aside, revealing a new path behind it, this one dark, choked with vines and shadow, pulsing not with light but with sorrow. And Elgan, weary and afraid, yet unable to deny the tug in his bones, rose. He stepped forward, into the past, into the truth, into the wound he had once helped carve. There is a kind of silence that exists only in old dreams and deep forests, not the absence of sound, but the suspension of meaning, a stillness so complete that even thought, that tireless rustler of mind's underbrush, curls itself into sleep, leaving the world untouched by interpretation. Into such a silence Elgan now stepped, guided not by certainty, nor by the crude compass of logic, but by the subtle, half-forgotten rhythm of a promise once whispered into the leaves of a tree that no longer bore his name. The path, if indeed it could still be called that, was no longer the gentle ribbon of moonlit moss that had led him beneath the twisted arch of Narthiel. It had become something darker, more intimate, as though the forest, having acknowledged his presence, had drawn him not into itself, but into its memory, a memory wild with sorrow, fragrant with longing, and haunted by the echo of things undone. Here, the trees no longer whispered, but watched. Their branches did not rustle, but reached, not with malice, but with the slow, aching desperation of those who have waited far too long for something that might never return. Leaves fell upward, water flowed sideways, and time, that faithful tyrant of all living things, seemed to falter in its step, like an old clock winding down not to stillness, but to question. Elgan walked slowly, his every movement trailed by a faint shimmer, like dust stirred in cathedral light. His staff, no longer merely a tool of balance, had become something of a litmus, humming low when danger approached, glowing faintly when the path aligned with purpose. He had ceased asking himself, how or why? The forest did not suffer such inquiries. Instead, he had become a man of gesture, of listening, of intuition woven from instinct and regret. After what may have been a day or a season, for here such measures had little dominion, Elgan arrived at the Grove of Echoes. It was a place he had once known in childhood, though then it had borne no name, only the strange joy of being both lost and found. A circle of silver birches stood in perfect symmetry, their bark white as bone, their leaves sharp as mirrors. No wind stirred them, yet they moved with breathless grace, swaying to music Elgan could feel but not hear. In the center of the grove, half buried in moss and vine, rose a statue. Or perhaps not a statue, but a frozen memory, a likeness too exact to have been shaped by chisel or fire. It was a boy, thin, barefoot, hair like rain clouds and eyes wide with wonder. It was Elgan, not as he was, but as he had been, before the pact, before the forgetting. The statue boy stared upward, his mouth slightly open, one hand reaching toward the sky where no sun shone. Elgan knelt before it, and as his fingers touched the stone hand of his younger self, the grove shivered. A voice, neither male nor female, neither old nor new, coiled into the air like smoke. "Why did you leave us?" He did not answer, for he could not. His mouth opened, but no words came, only breath, shallow, broken, shaped by memory's sting. Around him, the birches wept leaves that shattered upon the ground. Another voice, this on. "You took the flame and fled. We bore the ash." "I did not know," Elgan whispered, his voice more wind than speech. "I was only a child." "You were chosen," the grove said in chorus. "You were bound." A seed of memory, of flame, of the forest's own soul. It had been buried in his chest, not as burden, but as becoming. His task had been simple in theory: guard the balance, walk the paths, remember what must not be forgotten. But something had gone wrong. Something had broken. And he had run. The memory burned away like parchment too close to the hearth. Elgan staggered back as the statue crumbled, releasing not dust, but a shape, a flickering flame, no larger than a candle, hovering before him. "You abandoned your post," said the flame, not in anger, but with the weary gravity of truth. "I forgot," Elgan said, ashamed. "No," replied the flame, "you chose to forget." And in that moment, Elgan remembered why. It had been her, a girl, a wanderer, not of the forest, but of the world beyond. Lyra, with hair like dusk and laughter that turned stones to song. She had wandered into the forest by accident, or perhaps not. And Elgan, still new in his role, had found her beneath the moonthorn tree. She had been hurt, afraid, hungry. He had helped her, and she had stayed. Days became weeks. He told her stories. She told him lies. They kissed once, and the forest had sighed. But humans were not meant to stay. The pact was clear. No soul, not of the forest, may dwell beyond the arch of Narthiel. And when the elders came for her, Elgan had chosen, not the pact, not the balance, but love. He had taken the ember, torn it from the grove's heart, and fled with her into the outer world. And the forest had burned, not with fire, but with loss. The spirits had retreated. The songs had ceased. The balance had tilted, ever so slightly, but enough to bleed the roots and crack the stone. Lyra had died not long after, not from sickness or sorrow, but from the weight of being in a place that had never been hers to hold. And Elgan, mad with grief, had buried the ember, buried it deep within himself, and deeper still beneath forgetfulness. The flame before him now flickered. "You must return it," it said. "To where?" Elgan asked. "To the wound." A new path opened, not ahead, but downward. The trees parted, revealing a spiral of roots and stone leading into the earth. No light guided it, but the flame hovered before him, gentle and insistent. And Elgan, with hands that trembled not from fear but from awe, followed. There are descents that are not merely spatial, that do not spiral into earth but into essence, that do not bring you into darkness so much as into density, the thickening of time, of thought, of soul. Elgan now stepped into such a descent, where gravity itself did not pull but invite, and each step downward felt less like movement and more like confession, as if each root-coiled stair were listening, each slab of damp stone whispering back its own memories into the soles of his feet. The flame, small and pale and nearly human in the way it wavered, drifted ahead of him, humming, with a note that was not quite music, but not silence either, something between a heartbeat and a name being remembered. The walls around him were made not of stone, but of wood petrified by time. Bark that glistened like ancient amber, riddled with patterns too symmetrical to be mere knots or fungus. They were glyphs, living ones, and Elgan recognized them as he might recognize a childhood lullaby hummed through tears. These were the roots of the first tree, the pre-march, as the spirits once called it, the tree that bore no fruit, no leaf, no bloom, but memory alone. And Elgan, bearer of the forgotten ember, had returned to its heart, not as guardian, not yet as penitent, but as listener, for now was not yet the time to act, now was the time to witness. He passed beneath a low arch of tangled roots where the air became viscous, thick with the perfume of lost springs and extinguished moons. The flame paused and grew brighter, as though absorbing something unseen, then flared a cold blue. Before him opened a chamber vast as a cathedral and infinitely older. The walls curved like ribs around. A central well, and from the well rose a tree, no taller than a man, yet older than any mountain. Its bark was silvered with sorrow, its branches bare save for 7 leaves, each suspended in a breeze that did not blow, each trembling as though dreaming. This was the wound, not a place, not a tree, not even a thing, but a rupture made visible, the scar where Elgan's choice had broken the cycle. The flame hovered beside him. "Here lies the price," it whispered, "but not yet the redemption." From the shadows beyond the tree emerged figures, first mist, then shape, then form. They were not ghosts, though they bore the weight of death. Nor were they spirits, though they moved with the solemnity of the divine. They were echoes, the fractured remnants of those who had once served the balance, guardians like Elgan who had either failed or faded, now woven into the dream flesh of the forest itself. One stepped forward, tall, sexless, with skin like pine and eyes like cracks in ice. It spoke in a tongue that Elgan understood without knowing how, each word a sigh of wind through old leaves. "Elgan of the broken ember, you stand where no heart has beat in 1,000 turns. Do you seek penance or restoration?" He knelt, not out of submission, but out of weight, for their gaze bore down like winter. "I seek to restore what I have unraveled. I seek to return what I stole. I seek to mend the bond." Another figure emerged, smaller, hooded, hands like twigs soaked in honey. "Restoration requires not only return, but remembrance. Will you take the journey of thorns?" "I will," Elgan said, and the air seemed to draw in its breath. The echoes encircled him. The tree behind them pulsed, shedding one of its 7 leaves. As it drifted down, it touched Elgan's brow, and he fell into the vision. He stood now not in the hollow, but in a field, endless, sun-splashed, humming with bees and heavy with the scent of juniper. A boy ran across it, barefoot, wild-haired, laughing, himself no more than 8, chased by shadows not cast by light, but by memory. A woman called from the distance, his mother, long dead, her voice a melody he had buried under years of silence. She did not speak a name, but sang a tune, one that matched the hum of the flames still nestled somewhere inside his soul. He turned, and the field became fire. The sky cracked open, not with thunder, but with flame. The forest screamed, not with voice, but with the ripping sound of veins torn from soil. He watched the moonthorn tree fall. He saw Lyra turn, her face empty, her body sinking into the bog that would one day bear no flowers. And above it all, the ember floated, burning, crying alone. "Why did you not come back?" asked the wind. "Because I feared I would not be forgiven," he answered. "Then you never truly loved," said the wind, turning cold. Elgan fell again, this time into water, black and bottomless. He sank for what felt like years. When he rose, he was not in the vision, but back beneath the wound, curled at the base of the tree, the echoes silent around him. The flame hovered near. "You carry the ember still, but to return it, you must offer more than memory." "What then?" he asked. "Your name, yourself, all that you were and all that you would have been." He understood. The ember could not return to the forest unless it had a vessel, and he, bearer and betrayer, must now become that vessel in full. It was not death. It was something harder. It was forgetting again, but this time willingly, not to escape pain, but to preserve balance. The echoes raised their hands. The bark of the tree cracked. A cavity opened. Not a wound, but a cradle. Elgan stepped forward. The flame entered his chest, and he entered the tree. As his body merged with the wood, as his thoughts unraveled like thread returning to loom, he felt not fear, but release. The echoes began to sing, not a hymn, but a retelling, a rewriting of the story. In time, the wound would no longer bleed. In time, the forest would grow again. And in time, the name Elgan would fade, not into dust, but into green. The seasons turned, not with the mechanical rhythm of a clock, nor with the impatient ticking of human time, but with the ancient, deliberate slowness of moss creeping over stone, of roots encircling bone, of forests remembering themselves. The silent wood, which had been fractured and forgotten, began to breathe once more, not with the sharp gasp of a wound newly opened, but with the long, contented exhalation of a being coming back to itself after centuries of half-sleep. It was not a rebirth in the common sense, for the forest had never truly died. No, it had endured in a state of twilight, a suspended heartbeat, a long echo of its own former song. Now, with the ember returned and Elgan's sacrifice absorbed into the very marrow of the earth, the trees remembered how to listen, the stones remembered how to speak, and the wind, the wind, remembered how to carry voices older than language. Where once the soil had groaned under the weight of silence, new shoots rose, slow and sure and unbothered by haste. These were no ordinary plants. Their leaves bore the faintest veins of silver, as though they had been kissed by moonlight during their furesty breath. Fungi unfurled like ancient parchment, and birds, long absent from these branches, returned with songs that mimicked the whistles of lost spirits. Even the insects, those tireless archivists of decay and rebirth, resumed their sacred industry, weaving, feeding, pollinating, dying, as if they too had been waiting for the forest's pulse to resume. At the heart of this awakening, where the tree known once only as the wound had stood, a new form emerged, neither tree nor shrine nor tomb, but something that contained all three. From its bark flowed a sap, so clear it reflected not one's face, but one's memory. Beneath it, where Elgan had surrendered himself, a low hum persisted, not unlike the one that had led him there, a resonance that made leaves shiver and birds pause mid-flight. It was the forest's new song, and his name was no longer spoken, for it had become a note in that song. Villagers from the northern hamlets, once fearful of the silent wood's edge, began to notice subtle changes. Where once mushrooms rotted before they could be picked, now they bloomed in sacred spirals. Streams once dry and bitter now flowed with water, so pure it gave children dreams of wolves who wept and trees that remembered their names. The old women, those whose tongues were trained not only on gossip but on the deeper languages of gut and season, whispered that the wood had turned, not in vengeance but in welcome, and yet none dared to enter too far.
Not even now.
They knew, without ever having been told, that the forest had a guardian again. Not a man this time, nor woman, nor beast, but something else, something rooted and omnipresent, whose eyes were mossy and limbs wide as branches, who watched not with suspicion but with memory. A guardian who did not move, but through whom all movement passed. Some swore they saw him, a shimmer beneath moonlight, a hunched silhouette between birch trunks. A few children claimed a white fox with ember eyes watched over them when they wandered too close, and a hunter once returned weeping, saying he had seen his dead brother in the bark of a willow. Stories sprouted like mushrooms after rain, tales of a ghostly man who lit fires that danced without burning, of songs that echoed without a singer, of trees that leaned together to whisper secrets only the guilty could hear. And slowly, reverently, the people began to leave offerings at the forest's edge. A carved acorn, a feather wrapped in twine, a crust of bread touched by tears. None knew why they did it. None asked. Only the old, the nearly deaf and the nearly mad, remembered the name Elgan. And even they did not speak it aloud. Deep in the heart of the silent wood, where no map could guide and no memory could cling, the seasons passed not in a line but in a spiral. Time was no longer a tyrant, but a gardener. And in this spiral, something began to form, not in the sense of construction but of understanding. The forest, once silenced by betrayal and fractured by abandonment, now healed not through forgetting, but through integration. The pain had not vanished, it had become part of the soil. And so, Elgan, or the being that had once been Elgan, stirred. Not as flesh, for his body had long since been absorbed into the lignin and loam, but as presence, as pattern, as guardian not of paths or laws but of balance. His thoughts no longer flickered as words, but as sensations, the ache of winter's approach, the thrill of rain on bark, the sorrow of a fox's final cry. And yet something remained, a sliver of what he had been, a quiet echo, not memory but intention, a will distilled. It was that sliver that felt her Lyra. She came not as a ghost, nor vision nor figment, but as something older still, a spirit who had waited. In the in-between, trapped not by the forest, but by grief. Her form shimmered like frost on spring moss, delicate and dangerous. Her eyes, when they opened, carried all the winters that had passed since her drowning. "You came back," she said, though no air moved between them and no ears heard. And from the guardian, a ripple, a sigh of wind through ancient leaves. "I never left," it replied, not in words, but in the turning of petals toward the sun. Together they stood, not as lovers reunited, nor as souls forgiven, but as parts of the same broken
Whole.
She, the wound, he, the healing. She, the song unfinished, he, the rest that made it whole. And then she too faded, not in sadness, but in release. Elsewhere, in a city far from moss and root, a child was born with a birthmark shaped like an acorn.
As
She grew, she often dreamed of forests she had never seen, of flames that whispered, of eyes like stone and breath like bark. She sang songs no one had taught her and drew pictures of trees with hearts that pulsed. One day, at the age of 9, she told her father she wanted to walk east, where the green remembers. He laughed, patted her head, and said perhaps one day. He did not see how the leaves outside the window nodded in agreement. Back in the forest, the flame returned, the same that had once guided Elgan, now pale and dim and heavy with 1,000 memories. It hovered before the great tree at the center, then flickered 3
times.
From the bark emerged a whisper. "Not yet," it said. And so the flame waited, and the forest dreamed, and the silence, that deep, ancient silence, not of emptiness, but of fullness, of wholeness, returned.